Hi, today I'd like to talk about IPv6 and spend a little bit of time talking about sort of where we've come from and where we're going with IPv6. And so I've kind of titled this IPv6 in 2016, but I'd like to take a look backwards as well and see where we've come from. But let me start with a question to each of you, because I'm pretty sure this is not the first V6 presentation you've sat through, and the real question is, how many have you sat through? Just to make it a little easier, I've offered you a multiple choice kind of option, 20, 100, 1,000. I must admit, in my case, I'm pretty sure I've sat through more than 1,000 over the last 25 years or so. But to be brutally honest, I don't remember how many. So, you know, just in case you weren't paying attention or you were asleep at the time, I looked through my old V6 presentation packs. A few were still on plastic using overhead projectors. But I found one of the earliest ones I actually had in digital format, which came from some 14 years ago from my archives somewhere deep in China. I think it was in Shanghai somewhere. Cute temple, lots of them there. This was at an ICANN meeting in Shanghai in October 2002. And the issue even then was that what we were finding was that the various IPv6 cheer squads that had appeared at the time were busy telling us that IPv6 was brighter, it was shinier, it did things better, it was more miraculous. It somehow added some magic food to IP that just wasn't there in any other way. There was some compelling aspect of V6 that was just so wonderful everyone had to have it. It wasn't the case. It isn't the case. V6 is not magic wonder glue for networks. It doesn't do anything whatsoever that you can't do in V4 other than one thing. It has a much, much bigger address field. So, you know, to some extent, all that V6 does is allow you to address more things. It doesn't do it any better. It doesn't change any of the basic technology. And so, to some extent, V4 versus V6 didn't favour the adopter of V6 by having a superior product. It's the same old product. It's just IP. And so when you try and build a bigger network, you've kind of got this choice, the bottom line, if you will. And even then, the choice was, well, if we don't do V6 and we stay with V4, we're going to run out of addresses. That's obvious. And the only other way that we can address this problem of running out of addresses if we don't do V6 is to share the addresses we have across the larger pool of devices. And the technology we have to do that is, of course, network address translation, or NATS. So the choice at the time looked like it was going to be a choice of futures between NATS and V6. And the real question is, who makes that choice? Where does that decision get played out? And of course, it's a market choice, because no one's in control. The internet is the collective result of each of us acting in our own interest. And so that market of a large number of folk acting in self-interest has to balance the long-term risk issues against short-term expediency. And sometimes we're pretty bad about long-term risk. In fact, we're pretty bad about the future on the whole, that trying to make predictions is an extremely difficult game. Here's one that I kind of liked. This prediction: one day man will travel faster than a horse can run. Rene Descartes, French philosopher, 1800s or so. Look it up, Wikipedia is your friend. What an amazing prediction. At the time it was revolutionary. That the fastest thing you could see was birds and horses, and it was ridiculous to think that man could possibly fly, then trying to understand that we could devise a machine or some other artificial thing that would travel faster than a horse was an outlandish feat of wild, wide-eyed imagination. We look back today and go, puh, we've sent men to the moon. We've done impossibly weird things. Faster than a horse can run? No sweat. So sometimes you can be both right and amazingly wrong at the same time. And certainly Rene Descartes fulfilled that. So when we make predictions about V6, you can watch out that sometimes you can be right and wrong too. And by 2005, we were trying to understand what went wrong. Because up until then, we had this view that we simply had to standardize V6 and the world would follow. All we had to do was take this wonderfully nice technology, V4 with bigger addresses, and drop it by the side of the road, and all you ISPs, all you applications designers, all you industry folk would see this bright shiny package with its cute wrapping, and it probably had little ribbons on it too, and you'd pick it up, you'd unwrap it, and you would deploy it. But you don't. You haven't. The emerging realization, even 10 years ago, was it's not going to happen like that. That maybe there's some kind of competition in an open market where V6 is, if you will, stood against its competitive alternative. And of course, the competitive alternative was address sharing. And so cheaper and bigger win the day for short term. And that is not necessarily better, it's just cheaper. And V4 plus NATs is certainly, to some sense, looked cheaper on the day. And the leverage was that V6 wasn't just going to happen because we said so, it needed something more. We needed to understand this a little better. And so we started looking at this and trying to find what are the drivers? Why would you deploy V6? What's the natural advantage? Well, bigger addresses are useful for bigger networks. And at the time, even 2006, the iPhone had just hit the streets. And it was pretty clear that it was going to be a runaway success. But that runaway success had a number of dimensions. Already by then, mainframe computers were kind of yesterday. We could see the end of the desktop PC even then. Even laptops were looking as an interesting proposition, and they might not last forever either. The computers were getting smaller, more deeply embedded, and we were looking at very high volume deployments such as every car, every light switch, every light. And once you start looking at that kind of deployment, then all of a sudden V6 starts to offer reasonable solutions that give you very simple end-to-end functionality in a world that has billions of devices. But of course that's a future. That's one of those man will travel faster than the horse kind of futures. If you're at the age of the horse and you haven't invented the engine, that's kind of not going to help very much. And you'd find it difficult to build roads when no one's invented the car. So what we were finding was, although the case could be made, the case for widespread deployment of V6 wasn't a here and now proposition. We couldn't convince folk that it was time to act now rather than later. So we started to look around. Maybe looking at the market wasn't good enough. Maybe this was a case of market failure. That in deregulation, we'd left all these decisions to deregulated markets. And the problem is that deregulated markets are not perfect information markets. Sometimes externalized cost means that the pain becomes isolated from the remedy. Because when, as a service provider, you deploy a NAT to allow address sharing, most of your problems with address scarcity get solved immediately. You can share those small number of addresses across a relatively large number of customers, and you don't have a problem. You've externalized that issue of scarcity. But think of it from the point of view of the application designer. All of a sudden, applications cannot assume that an address is an endpoint that is stable, that addresses change, and the same address might be presented for multiple endpoints, that who you are is no longer your address, it's something else. And that requires applications to move additional cost, to actually incur additional complexity, and even additional fragility, because all of a sudden connections are mediated by middleware. So the pain is isolated from, if you will, the gain. You, the ISP, deploying the NAT, easy. The application folk trying to make persistent identity work, much more of a problem. And so the market itself wasn't giving clear signals out there as to what to do. So we looked again around and said, well, how can we make a case for V6 that was compelling, that really did echo and resonate? And we looked at the market of tiny things, taking that world of chattering devices and actually trying to understand what are the economics of such a market? How do we cram billions of new devices with trillions of packets into the same network we run today? And the observation was, as long as we can make the network cheaper, all this will work. But if we can't make the network cheaper, it won't work. So maybe cheaper networks are the answer. And one way to build cheaper networks is to strip out the silicon, is to get rid of the NATs and to actually provide networks that do as little as possible for as many packets per second as possible, to make things 1,000 times cheaper than today. Maybe that's the way of doing it. But even that didn't take off. So when we're looking at this problem, we thought, well, perhaps it's time to get back to the basic reason why we did 6 in the first place. That the reason why V6 was invented was very simple. We didn't have enough addresses to do V4. And if you wanted to get out of that hole, we had to do something. So what were we telling ourselves back in 2008, just a couple of years before exhaustion? Here's some slides from back then. It's a presentation I gave, I've forgotten where. But by 2008, it was pretty clear we had around about 3 years to go. By early 2011, it was all going to be over. The Iona pool would exhaust itself. The train had come off the V4 tracks, and they would actually crash by then. And the question, of course, back then is, what were we going to do? What happens when we run out of addresses? And of course, the obvious answer is, it was going to be V6. We were going to strap a jet engine on the train. Don't you love that photo? It was a Russian job, I believe. And you kind of wonder how it could ever go round a corner. Anyway, the plan was that we'd never actually hand out the last V4 address. The plan was that the mere threat of V4 exhaustion would force the world into taking V6 seriously. And that would gather momentum, and by the time we got close to the end of the V4 pool, V6 deployment would be so ubiquitous, V4 would wither and die because it wasn't needed anymore. We were talking to an industry that a decade before had planned for the year 2000 bug, remember that? Had taken 12 years to plan its IT systems. There were telephone companies setting up Y2K committees in the late 80s. We thought the threat of address exhaustion would have got this industry moving a lot faster than that. We thought that this would have already happened. What we encountered was that nothing had happened, that the V4 pool size was getting smaller and smaller, the end was in sight, and the amount of V6 deployment was, well, nothing. That was a problem. Now, one optimist view was there was still time. Within the 12 months or so left before V4 exhaustion, that we could salvage the problem, that we could get rid of the problem, we could move to V6. We could quit all of our use of V4 within a year. Now, it would probably take divine intervention, because that's the only way that you could have changed 1.7 billion users, we're 3.4 billion now, around 5 billion devices, millions, billions of lines of configuration code, change of all of that within a year. Well, obviously, that kind of optimism is just completely misplaced. The pig will never fly, because quite frankly, big and fast don't go together. The internet is big. It's the largest single technical artifact we understand these days. It's the most amazing achievement we've ever built. But that means, being so big, it doesn't change very easily or quickly. Big and fast don't go together. So we couldn't avoid exhaustion. We could not avoid that. So maybe it's time for plan B. Take the V6 deployment at a more leisurely pace and rely on NATs holding the world together. Now, NATs are good, but the question is, how good and for how long. We're now around 5 years after the initial deployment, the initial exhaustion point, early 2011. The first regional internet registry to run down was APNIC in 2012. So things happened slowly, but they happened inevitably. Sorry, it was 2011. Since then, the network has doubled in size. Since then, we now have a network that spans more than 10.5 billion devices. And interestingly, we use around 1.5 billion v4 addresses. So we're using a sharing ratio of around 7 to 1, 8 to 1, and that so far as we can tell, are holding up. That we've been able to cram that kind of overuse of addresses into existing NATs. But how long does it have to run? Because if the v6 deployment is that leisurely, maybe we have to bargain for another decade, another 10 years, maybe 20 years. How big will the internet be by then? If the silicon industry has its way, the network will encompass, well, easily 40 billion devices, possibly 100 billion. Now all of a sudden then you're relying on a compression ratio of not 7 to 1, but 100 to 1. And at that point you start to strain credibility. We can do NATs, but how are we at doing NATs? I'm not sure we're that good. I'm not sure address sharing is that elastic and that flexible. The underlying mechanics of v4 won't let you achieve that kind of payback. So at some point you reach the end and it all just blows up in your face. And that's not a very good outcome. So if you can't deploy v6 in time and what you're relying on won't last forever, then what are you going to do? Well, good question. Why are we here and what are we doing? And there's no clear answer for that. There was no clear answer then, no clear answer now. But we are getting more sophisticated in our arguments. We looked beyond technology and started to wonder about the money. How and why was v6 not being deployed rapidly? And certainly economics gave us some pointers as to why it was not happening. You didn't deploy v6 because what you saw was cost without revenue. So you were spending more money, but at the same time you weren't changing the user's perception of the value of your product. So they weren't going to pay you any more money because as far as they were concerned it was the same product, but you were spending more money because of dual stack in producing that product. That's never going to work, is it? All of a sudden you're sitting there at the wrong side of a demand-supply equilibrium, and the folk who deploy v6 become marginalised. The ones who sit on v4 and run NATs are actually more efficient as producers. So that might well give you a reason as to why it hasn't happened. But the issue is, it's in everyone's interest to go there. So why are short-term and long-term in the internet become so disconnected? Why isn't v6 on everyone's agenda here and now? And maybe this is a bit like climate change. Maybe your short-term interest and my short-term interest in cheaper energy bills, paying less for my electricity, not more, means that I'm perfectly happy to have coal-fired power generators. But the planet is not. All that carbon dioxide being pumped into the atmosphere, all those cars, all those gases, doesn't give us a very good outcome. We know that the long-term climate change is horrible. Now, this is much the same as in the internet itself, that the short-term answer, to share v4 addresses amongst more people, and the long-term answer, get out of this. Let's just go to a network that has the addressing technology to address 100 billion devices and more. The long-term answer isn't part of anyone's short-term plan. And so somehow we needed some kind of external impetus to get us from where we are to where we need to be. In thinking about that impetus, we started to wonder if peer pressure wasn't the answer. If somehow we could create the impetus for V6 by saying, everyone else is doing it, you should too. And that everyone else is doing it, you should too, led us to an effort in 2012 from the Internet Society, which was the World V6 launch. Had a logo, so it must have been serious. The motto that came with it went, this time it's forever. And it was urging service providers on that day, the 6th of the 6th, 2012, to turn on V6 and leave it on, once and forever. And the idea was to reach out to everyone and say, look, it's time to start moving. Everyone's doing it. Come and join us. You should too. And of course, straight after we started to actually wonder, did it work? Were any measurements showing that the V6 launch made any difference to the trajectory of uptake? One of the harsher ways of looking at this is to look at the BGP routing table. And you can see the first attempt at this, the World IPv6 Day, 6th of June 2011, there was a slight amount of uptake over and above the average just before the day, but then it all trailed off. And you could argue even in 2012 there was an even smaller amount of uptake before the day, but then it just trailed off. And so interestingly, no, it didn't really work, did it? Not really. So where are we today? How can we take stock of where we are? Originally, we thought the internet would avoid complete V4 exhaustion and have dropped V6 before that time. It's pretty clear that hasn't happened. Here's where we are now on each of the address pools. ARIN ran out. APNIC ran out. RIPE and APNIC kept 1/8 in reserve, and they're slowly going through that reserve block. APNIC is currently sitting at around 1.6/8s, around 24 million addresses or so. At the current consumption rates, it has about 2 years to go, and then nothing. You're going to have to buy your addresses, and buying addresses on the open market won't be cheap. It isn't cheap. It's at least $10 an address currently. An increased amount of scarcity pressure can only make the price go up, not down. So it's time. It's time to think about your own plans, because the issue is NATs will work for a while, but no one could ever say that they're going to work forever. And the only other solution we have other than NATs is V6, because there's no other alternative left in the piggy bank of technology. It's V6, it's NATs, it's nothing else. So if the NATs aren't going to work, you've got no choice left. But networks are special. Very large-scale distributed networks, and that's what we have, a very large-scale distributed network, needs to keep in sync with each other. You can't do something different and stay connected, because connectivity is all about doing the same thing that everyone else does. If a network heads down its own technology path, it gets isolated, it has little residual value, there's no point. And so one of the major things we need to understand when we try and do something like a V6 transition is to measure the network to understand what everyone else is doing at the same time as you and I, because we all need to keep in sync. And so at APNIC, we've been doing large-scale measurement. We've been using Google Ads to help us out, but basically we sample around 11 million unique users a day and give them a very simple test embedded in the ad that says, can you fetch this V6 URL? Can you do V6? And the result is we compile these maps, and this is a map of V6 today in the world. If you're green, that means that every user in your country was able to do V6. No one's got green. There are a few countries that are coloured better than dark red, 0. So those countries are, and let me help you in the next slide here, those countries are Belgium, the United States, Germany, Switzerland, Greece and Portugal. Belgium, around half of the country's users are actually able to collect a V6 URL. They're able to do V6. For the other 5 countries, it's around 1/3. Now, some of the issues are consumer premises equipment, old-style modems, and so on and so forth. But also it is the ISPs themselves. And we can look in a little more detail at a couple of these countries to see what's going on inside the country. So when we look at Belgium, it's pretty clear that the largest three providers, Belgacom, Telenet and AS Brutel, which collectively appear to have about 80% of the market share in that country, the second two, Telenet and Brutel, are actually doing 3/4 of their user base is now capable of running V6. And the larger one, Belgacom, Skynet, is doing it around 50%. Pretty amazing achievement. But oddly enough, the next two biggies, Mobistar and Numeric Cable, aren't doing any V6 whatsoever. And that's why it's not 100% in Belgium, it's still only 50% of the country. The United States is a much larger country, of course, many more people, and the largest provider in that largest country is Comcast. Comcast has rolled out V6 everywhere across its US network. Now, the 63% V6 capable is largely a reflection of the fact that not every consumer in that network has upgraded their own local equipment to support V6. When you look to a network that has a slightly different footprint, and Cellco 22394 is one of these, which is predominantly a mobile provider against smart devices in your hand, those devices upgrade far more frequently. So when Verizon, Cellco, turned on V6, their V6 uptake rate is a phenomenal 89%. So some of the big providers, Comcast, AT&T, Cox Communications, Verizon, have turned on V6 across most of their network. Other providers, however, UUNet, Charter and so on, appear to be more, well, lackadaisical really, a little bit more lazy, more relaxed about V6 and are taking their time. The last of these countries I want to look at which are big is Germany. Deutsche Telekom, which is the major provider, 1/2 of its user base is now V6. They're in the middle of an absolutely massive rollout. And the number 3 there, Kabel Deutschland, is also in the middle of a relatively extensive rollout. So those are the big 3 that have done V6. They also happen to be major world economies. Let's now go a little closer to home and look at the Sudan. As far as I can see, there are a small number of providers. The major providers are SDN Mobitel, Sudatel, and MTN SD. The number 4 is Canatel, and number 5 is Sudren, which I think is the academic and research network. But that's the network that's done V6. They've deployed V6, and at least 1/3 of their user base is busy reporting that yes, they can do V6 and retrieve V6 URLs. That's amazing. Because not only is it number 1 in Sudan, but it's number 1 in Africa. Because Sudan has the highest rate of V6 penetration of the entire continent. At that 0.18%, which is attributable to Sudren, is actually the reason why Sudan stands out as being the more V6 than anyone else in any other country in the entire continent of Africa. So well done, Sudren. Nice achievement. But 0.18% isn't really impressive, is it? Like, the others need to do something, don't they? So what's the bigger picture? Well, it's certainly true that V6 deployment isn't happening everywhere, and it's not happening all at once. But you can't say it's not happening. It is happening, and it is happening in some major world economies. And in those economies, there's quite intense V6 activity. So what we hear is, I'm waiting for others, I'll jump when they jump. But who are the they you're waiting for? Because if you're waiting for the United States to jump, I think you're too late. If you're waiting for Germany to jump, you're too late. Japan, France, Switzerland. Which economy are you waiting for if you're not waiting for the major economies around the world? I'm like, who's there left to wait for if everyone else is moving? So is it still a waiting game? Are these large-scale service providers basically like Comcast, like Verizon, like AT&T, like Deutsche Telekom, like the old France Telecom, Orange, is that enough? Will that break out of a waiting game? Well, I'd certainly like to think so. I'd like to think that that's enough to actually shift us out of the mess we're in now. Because while NATs are carrying a network of 10 billion devices, we're not sure how it will manage with 20 billion, and we certainly don't understand 100 billion. But what we do know is the silicon industry is going to produce 100 billion devices over the next five years or so. They're not going to stop. And if we're going to make them all talk to each other, then each of you have to look at what Sudan has done and understand, why shouldn't you do it too? It's not hard, you just need to do it. Thank you. And I'd now like to actually re-ask the question I asked at the start. For myself, I still don't know how many V6 presentations I've sat through, but in your case, you've sat through one more. Thank you very much, and thank you for your attention. And again, I'm sorry I couldn't be there, but I hope this has been of interest. Thanks.